right, hi everyone. My name is Galen Corey, and I'm here today to talk to you about componentization in Angular 1. And it's not transitioning. All right, so I have a confession to make. I really love Angular, so much that I actually carved our names together into a tree, sort of like at the beginning of the Blank Space music video with Taylor Swift. But also, like in Blank Space, we have some issues. The biggest problem with Angular 1's architecture is usually called the scope soup architecture. And I think we've all been there, where our controller is getting really out of control. We've got a lot of things on scope, but we're like, wait, I just need to put this one other thing, and it's not really related, but it just really needs to be on there. And that gives you scope soup architecture. And that's defined by lots of junk on your controller, lots of junk on your scope, templates and controllers that don't have a one-to-one relationship, loose rules for inheritance of information, so there's really no strictness about how information is passed and what has access to what. And this kind of code is easy to write, but hard to maintain. This is a nice diagram of scope soup architecture. It's from an article called How to Modernize Your Crufty AngularJS Codebase in one simple step at a time. And you can see that some of the controllers are one-to-one with templates. Some controllers have 2 templates. Some controllers have no templates. And there's not a real correspondence between the controller and what it's controlling. And there are better ways to do this than the way we've been writing code in Angular 1 so far. Angular 2 was released in September 14, 2016, so last month. React is rapidly growing in popularity, and these are both component-based architectures. Now, I'm going to be saying component a lot, and when I say component, think these guys in your HTML, but linked to a controller, so it's very one-to-one. And Angular 1 is not a component-based architecture, at least not the way we've usually been writing it. Pete Bacon-Darwin, the lead Angular 1 developer, says that components are the future of web apps. So what, do I have to learn Angular 2 now? No. This is from the same diagram above, except it's showing you how you can refactor your Angular 1 to make it more component-based and therefore more maintainable, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. Angular 1.5 to the rescue. Angular 1.5 is a new version of Angular that has a bunch of features to help you write more component-based code. It's released February 5th, 2016, and it has updates to help you componentize your Angular 1. Here are some features. Component directives. I'm going to start talking about component directives, which is different than components, the theory. Component directives are just like our normal directives, but they have some extra features to them. One-way data bindings. We'll also talk about that. And these other things I'm not going to talk about, but they also help you write in a component-based style. Angular 1.5 components. I'm now talking about the component that you'll see in your HTML. They're just like directives, except they have isolate scope by default. They use controllers instead of link functions. They automatically use controller as syntax. And they have some other goodies that you should Google. All of this stuff is syntactic sugar for directives. So these things essentially are directives, but they help you write your code in a more component-based style, and they help you avoid falling into that scope soup trap, where you're like, maybe I'll just put that one thing in. This is an example of how to define an Angular 1.5 component. It looks a lot like defining a directive, but you write component instead of directive. I don't know if you remember, but usually a component, you have to pass it a function that returns an object. Here you just pass it an object. And there's some other things that help you just save time like that. One other feature that works really well with components is one-way data bindings. We remember these guys. Angular 1.5 also gives us this guy, which is a lot like the equal sign, but it's a one-way data binding. And what that means is when you pass information through a one-way data binding, the child that's seeing that information can access it, it can read it, but it can't change it within the parent's scope. I'll show you some examples of that a little bit later on. And another feature in Angular 1.5 is controller as syntax, which is really big if you're trying to write code that will be easy to refactor into Angular 2 later. A lot of times you want to make your Angular 1 as structurally similar to Angular 2 as possible, And Angular 2 actually doesn't really use scope. They treat their controllers as classes. And controller as syntax allows you to also treat your controller as a class. So on the left, you can see a controller the way you're used to writing it. I have scope, and I give scope.name a property that says Galen. And then in your HTML, you just say name is cool. That will print out Galen is cool. Now on the right, we're treating that controller as a class. Instead of, oh, you don't pass this into the function. That's a typo. Don't pass this into the function. You just treat it as a class. And you can say this.name is Galen, and then in your HTML, you'll access it by saying $CTRL.name is cool. So that will give you Galen. The reason we use $CTRL is because in Angular 1.5 components, the controller is automatically aliased as CTRL. So that's just a way, long story short, this is a way to make your code more similar to Angular 2 without actually writing Angular 2. Let's do an example of refactoring with components. So here's an app that I wrote in the way that we already know how to write apps. It's a simple Harry Potter app that says, welcome to Hogwarts, please sign in. And you say who you are, it says hello to you, and it gives you a picture of you in case you forgot what you look like. And the way I accomplish this, since it's one page, I'm just using one controller, right? So on my scope, I've got students, and that populates my select box. I've got a selected student, which is a Boolean telling you whether to display the photo or not. And I've got my images, which is an object. And then if you were to look into your HTML, I just have all of those written directly into the body. My H2, my select box, my P, my image. I'm going to refactor this with components. And keep in mind, this is a very small application, so it's not that out of hand. But I think we've all written one-page applications that get pretty out of hand. And this is a way to sort of modularize what you're writing so that everything is clearly related to, so that all the components are directly related to their templates and their controllers. So let's refactor this. This is my same app, this time using components. So if you go to my app.js, instead of having everything on here, I'm just defining the app here. And if I go to my index.html, we're just looking at the body, even though there's all that head stuff. In the body, I just have my h1 and my name picker. That's a component. That's an example of what a component will look like in your HTML. Let's look at that name picker a little closer. In the HTML, it has a select box, which is clear because there is a select box here. But it also has a greeting component, and it has a name component. And notice that I'm passing some information in to these components. I'm assigning the name to be equal to selected student. And also notice $CTRL. We're using controller as syntax here. I'm passing that information in, so that's how it's going to know. Let's look at greeting.js. Well, greeting doesn't even actually need a controller, because greeting just takes that name parameter that was passed in, and it uses a one-way binding. That means that if it did have a controller, it couldn't reassign name, even if it wanted to. It can't change the names that are appearing in here, because that would be pretty messed up. It's just accessing that information, and it has a small template. And similarly, the photo has access to the name, and it has a controller that has its images, but it doesn't have to store all that other information for the select box. So this is much more component-based in that everything is directly related to its HTML presence, and there's not a lot of extra information floating around. Are there any questions on that before I move on? Cool. All right. So to sum up, I still love Angular 1, and there are ways that you can write it in a way that makes it more component-based and easier to update to Angular 2 if you ultimately decide to do that. Thank you.